Henderson. Okay, you were telling us about your...
Yes, I was serving as supply and dispersing officer aboard the high-speed minesweeper, and we were part of the supposed to be part of the invasion of Okinawa. But before we got there, our ship had a lot of mechanical troubles. It was a very old ship. It was an old World War I destroyer that was converted to a high-speed minesweeper, and we had a lot of mechanical troubles with it, so we never did really get there. And so then we were later sent back to San Diego and had repairs done. And finally, then they never got the ship working very good, and finally the ship was decommissioned, and I was transferred to a refrigerator ship, and I was home on leave between ships when the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. And we remember hearing about that on the radio. Of course, didn't really know what it was. Certainly didn't know the significance of it at that time. But then I had to go back and was supply and dispersing and cargo officer aboard a refrigerator ship, and didn't get back home until in the summer of 1946.
Did you live at home in Monticello when he was...
I lived with him in Chicago area when he was going to Great Lakes, getting his training. And then I came back home and lived in my dwelling there on East Lafayette Street. And then when he was home for a short bit, and before I went in to overseas duty, I went out to San Francisco, as he stated. I was with him a couple months. Of course, then I was at Cambridge with him before that. And that was an interesting life out there, because the Eastern people are, I always consider them kind of proud and haughty. And that's been so many years ago. They used to have a monkey grinder come around to our old dwelling out there. And of course, our youngster was only 3 years old then, so she doesn't remember too much about our happenings out there. It was when they had an ice shortage out there. We were out there during the summer months, which was really an uncomfortable time. Of course, didn't have air conditioning then either. But no, I was home most of the time during those little trips.
Were you affected by the rationing?
Definitely. We were all suffered that. I think that people like myself suffered worse than the others, though, because I still had his ration book before he went into service, which I felt that I was entitled to use. We had to use it for shoes, and of course your vegetables and meats and so on. But Jane, being at the age she was, you have to supply them with shoes more frequently. Their feet grow and so on. So I was glad to have his ration book until he went into service. But those days we always saw, if we saw a line, we generally got into it. We didn't know what they were selling at the other end of the counter, whether it be sheets or nylon stockings, but we often joked about, or maybe cigarettes. They were a hard thing to come by. That didn't affect either of us because we didn't smoke, but those were days that I'm glad are past.
You got in the line whether you
Yes.
knew what it was or not.
That's
You know,
right.
tires were rationed, sugar was rationed. Most
Meats.
of the things were in short supply. So some of the things actually you had to have coupons, and some you didn't. But those that you didn't have to have coupons, and many times you couldn't get it anyway. So everyone was affected with it, but we just we took it in stride, and that's part of war.
Do you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Sure.
Remember it real well because that's my birthday.
It's her birthday, and
And-
we were at her folks having a birthday dinner when I heard it on the radio.
And our daughter was just a matter of a month old. And
Were you terribly shocked, or did you feel
Oh,
like something
yes.
like that was coming?
Well, there had been a lot of discussion about the the officials of the Japanese government actually were in Washington at that time, supposed to be negotiating about it. But it's always, war was all around us, you see. It had been going on in Europe, but it's still a great, it's a shock when you find out that your country is finally in it and that it's going to affect your life. And yes, it's a shock.
And I know what Mother and Daddy, of course, the birthday party was there, thought, well, here we have 5 daughters. They're all married, how that'll affect each one of them. So, and of course our son, didn't go into service because he was a producer in the farm and so on, and the dairy and all this, through business. Kept him at home, but it affected all of us.
How much were you aware at that time of what was actually going on in Germany with the concentration camps?
Didn't know it at all. You see, you got your news in those days, first by radio, second by newspapers mostly. And then when you went to the movies, there was what they call movie-tone news, which was run in between the movies, you see, because there was no TV. So you got most of it really by newspaper, some radio and some the other. No, we didn't know that was going on.
When we were in Chicago, when you were getting your training there, they had, on State Street, they had a theater there that did nothing but news. It'd be as long as a movie, but of course that was well attended because people were eager to see some of the live things were happening.
You knew all about Hitler, of course. He'd been in the news for many years, but
not
as far as the concentration camps are concerned, no, we had no idea about that.
To go back just a little bit, you told me last time when I talked to you about they used ice for the air conditioning. It's very
yes.
Can you tell us about that?
That's right. My father had there's a big, I think about 4 or 5 feet high cylinder, and ice was dropped in there, and a fan blew over that, and that gave the air a nice coolness. And he would use this for the homes, and if there were meetings that they knew that was going to be well attended and hot, he would loan that out to meetings or sick rooms. And I don't know, but it's the only one I ever saw. It's kind of a monstrosity, but when my mother had a big missionary meeting at her house one day, and I thought, the fan wasn't quiet, but at least they were comfortable, that thing sitting in the middle of the living room.
You know, when the new theater building was built and opened in 1937, there was no air conditioning in that. But the way it got cool was that back on the alley side, they had a large air handler there and a big fan, and it pulled air from the alley through a door that opened and shut in the back of that building. And then it had a pan inside that had water in it, and then some pipes came up out of that pan, and about 6 o'clock at night, every night I would take a truckload of ice down and cut it up into 25-pound pieces and put it into that pan, and then that made that water cold, and the water was pumped up through those nozzles and sprayed in the air, and it dropped back down in the pan, but the air was pulled from the alley across through that cold water, and that was piped into the theater, and that's how the theater got
the
cool.
forerunner of air conditioning.
That's right. But by 8 o'clock at night or 8:30 at night, if the movie house was full many times in those days, it still got warm in there. But that was the air conditioning.
And before, when we talked too, you mentioned that there were really two types of people in Monticello during the
Yes,
20s and
before the Depression, or before 1930, I would say, Monticello was distinctly had two types of people. It had the people who lived on North State Street, who were the rich people, and the rest of us who weren't. And they had a world of their own, and the rest of us did not enter into that world much because we didn't have that kind of money.
Well, they were known as the 400, weren't they?
Yes, but there were 7 millionaires in a row living on North State Street at that time.
Why were they called the 400?
Well, that's just what the rich people were called in those days. The Society of the 400. Now, I don't know where that came from, but that was just an expression for people who had wealth in those days, and those people had wealth. So there were the Dightons and the Kirbys and the Moores and the Hotts and the Burgesses, and they were all rich.
How many of the families lost a good share of their fortune in the Depression?
Well, I would say that most all of them did. Some of them completely, and others to a great extent. But I suppose that of all of those families that lived there, I suppose that the Hott family lost the least. And I might add something about the Hott family. You're familiar with the house that was called the Hott House. When I was a bookkeeper for the Monticello Grain Company in 1933, John Hott, who then was the manager of the Caldwell plant and had formerly been part owner of it, but he had some farmland too, and he would come into the office, and Piet Kratz would come there, and Bert England, and many of the landowners would come into the office to see what the price of the grain were, because that's the only way they could find out. They didn't give them on the radio in those days. So they would be in there talking and kidding each other, and I remember they got to talking about John Hott's house. It wasn't too old at that time. And John Hott said that house cost him $40,000 to build, and all of the woodwork in it was solid walnut. And Piet Kratz said, "Oh, John, what are you complaining about? The Board of Trade gave it to you." And John says, "Yes, but I gave it back to him a couple times." But that Hott house originally cost $40,000 to build, and the woodwork was all solid walnut.
When did you two, what do you recall your first date? Since you
I know
sort
our
of grew
first
up
date.
together.
I was a freshman and he was a senior in high school. And a country boy was having a sleigh ride out on Allerton Road. And we were invited. Andy was invited. And he was to bring his girlfriend. I happened to be it. I remember my parents had to say, "Oh, go along." I didn't want to go because I'd never had a date. I was too bashful. "Now go along. Brother Bob's going with his date." Anyway, we went, and
I think it was really it was initially a church-sponsored thing, wasn't it?
not that I remember.
Maybe not.
Varner, Steve Varner.
Yeah, Steve.
And anyway, we had a real great sleigh ride, and then we went back to his house, and we had chili and donuts and all that kind of thing out in the country home. And that was our first date. So that started things off. Freshman,
So we went
senior.
together 7 years before we were married.
Had to wait until leap year, and finally I dropped the question. I said, "Now or never."
Had to get an education first.
What was your wedding like?
We had a big church wedding.
It's in the Presbyterian Church here.
I think everybody in town was invited.
And it was a very hot evening. It was on Saturday night, very hot evening. And just to show you what the prices were in those days, hadn't been too long ago we saw it. We had the bill from McGinnis's for all of the flowers to decorate the church, and all of the flowers that all of the people, and there were several attendants in the wedding, all of their flowers, the whole thing, and the bill was $25.
And I think our invitations, which there used to be a printer here in Main Quarter, I think they were less than $15, something like that. It was, you just can't believe prices today compared to what they were then.
And Laura Peck cooked the dinner for us after the wedding at her folks' house.
So you had a dinner for, did all your guests come back?
No, that was just for the attendance.
Just for the attendance, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a chance for a honeymoon?
We went to Champaign that night.
Urbana Lincoln.
Stayed all night at the Urbana Lincoln Hotel and gave $4 for the room. And then this was on Saturday night, and of course I had to be at work in Chicago Monday morning. So my sister and her husband, who lived in Chicago, and they were down with a car. We didn't have a car. So we rode back to Chicago with them on Sunday, and I went to work on Monday morning.
Where did you live in Chicago?
We lived on the west side in on Mayfield Avenue, which was what was then called the Austin District, which was just immediately east of Oak Park.
We neither really liked the city. We both kind of cornbread, but I particularly had nothing to do. It was a lovely apartment building, and what you call efficiency apartment, and you had maid service and a Murphy bed pulled down out of the wall, and nothing to do. And we were pretty pinched. Those were the days when Andy gave me $1 a day for groceries. That was $7 a day.
$7 a week?
I mean, a week, pardon me. And towards the end of the week, money kind of dwindled. So Mother and I had canned green beans. We had put them up in pint jars. So generally about weekend, we'd have green beans and potatoes and onions and bacon as one dish, and then some jelly with it and bread. So we were thankful we had that. But I remember the day that the elevateds were 10 cents to 7 cents to go down, and I had 14 cents in my purse just to do nothing but just to ride the elevator and down there and go up the 9th floor of Marshall Fields and ride down the escalator just to see the sights. And I often thought, hang on to my 7 cents, how would I get home? Yes, they did go up to 10 cents later on.
Yeah, you see, I started to work, got paid $110 a month, and we paid $40 a month for our apartment. And I had to borrow some money from the university the last year I was in university. So we were paying back on that.
And you were paying my rings.
I didn't have her rings paid for. So we were paying, I think, about $5 a month on the rings. And I needed a hat, and because it got cold in Chicago.
And that hat cost $5.
We had to save quite a while before we could put together $5 to buy a hat.
So times have changed.
Times have changed.
We were glad to move back to our own territory again.
Well, after you came back after the war, then, what did you do?
Well, I was still in the cold storage locker business and stayed in there until 1950. And the First State Bank had been started in 1946. And Gerald Hofferty, who was at that in 1950 was president, and he needed another person in the bank, and I had shown some interest, and we talked and got together, and I started at the bank on August the 1st in 1950, and in January of 1951 I was named the vice president of the bank, and
meanwhile,
was vice president until 1972 when I was named the president of the bank.
Then meanwhile the lager plant burned down.
1952. and I was elected mayor in 1949. And,
How did you happen to decide to run for mayor?
well, I had some people come and talk to me about it, and I said I wasn't even interested. I didn't know anything about government, and
I was definitely not interested
wasn't
in
interested in it. But they talked around a while, and they came back 3 or 4 different times, and I finally said, well, okay, if you can't find anybody else. And
That's
so
all they needed.
nobody else ran, and I was elected mayor.
Was that when you
And
got
was,
$1 a day for your services?
Yes, it was $30 a month you got paid. That wasn't the point, though, really. But
That is truly
we,
a thankless job. It really is.
all of the, I shouldn't say all, but many of the streets in Monticello were just plain oiled streets in those days, like you remember when you used to oil roads in the country. Well, that's the way the streets were, vast majority of them. So that was one of the first projects that I wanted to do, and the council did too, and we did, was to what they call blacktop all the streets that were not paved at that time. Well, of course, many of those now since then have been paved, but we had our whole police department, and at that time was 2 people. We had 1 police car, and the way you got a hold of a policeman in those days was you called the sheriff's office, and that was in the courthouse, and if it was the police, the city police that was wanted, then there was a red light hanging on the northwest corner of the courthouse, and there was a switch in the sheriff's office, and they just turned on that red light, and the police would ride by and see if that light was on, and if it was, they would either go up to the sheriff's office or go to telephone and call the sheriff's office and find out what was wanted. And they, as I say, there were just 2 policemen, and they took turns working their days, but they only worked until midnight, and so there were no policemen on duty from midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning. But we got along very nicely with that arrangement, and of course we always did work closely with the sheriff's department, so if they needed help, why, the sheriff's department helped too. But we didn't have a large budget in those days, and we didn't have...
They picked up all the garbage.
Yes, the city picked up the garbage at that time, but it was not a very good service, and that was one of the things that I wanted to change too right away, and did change right away, and got that into private business. I didn't like the city being in the garbage business because it wasn't working very well. So it's been in private business since then. But being a mayor is an interesting experience.
Well, and during your serving, being mayor, they changed the street lights on North State Street.
Yes, and around the square, General Cable. I was mayor when General Cable came here in 1955, and we negotiated with them quite a while before they started their plant here, and I did all that negotiating with them, and got their plant here, and it's been a good addition to the city of Monticello. Well, we did a lot of things in those days. It seemed like the community worked together more back 25 or 30 years ago than they seemingly do now. We had the Chamber of Commerce was first formed then, and we had our first meeting of the Chamber of Commerce in what was then the community building, which was a house that was sitting where the Eisner food store is now.
Mm-hmm.
and that's where we had the first meeting. I was one of the early treasurers of the Chamber of Commerce and later became president several years later. And but we worked closely together and did a lot of things together. I don't know whether anyone ever told you about after World War II, the American Legion conducted for, I think it was 4 years, what they call the Firecracker Festival. Did anyone ever talk to you about that? Well, this was put on for a week during whatever week 4th of July was on. It was put on in the what's now the Forest Preserve Park. We had a lot of things out there. It was sort of a fair type thing. Carnival and
organizations brought out
yes,
their wares to sell, and they had stands.
We had one of the major dance bands here every night. You see, back in those days, that was in the era of the big bands. Mm-hmm. And Wayne King was here. Lawrence Welk was here.
Freddie Martin
was here. Griff Williams was here. Duke Ellington was here. Many of the large bands.
They danced
Guy
in the
Lombardo.
pavilion.
They danced
In the pavilion.
And then later we had an outside dance floor, maple floor, that we rented and put down. I remember when Freddie Martin was here, we sold tickets that night for 2,000 couples, and when Freddie Martin was here.
Now, about what years was this one?
This was from 1947 to 1951.
And the bands would just come in for the one night?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we generally had a different band each night. And I remember that Guy Lombardo, I think, was the most expensive band we had, and we had to guarantee these bands up front, and we had to guarantee him $3,500. But he did not draw the largest people. Freddie Martin drew the largest number of couples, and we sold 2,000 tickets to that night, 2,000 couples. Mm-hmm. And this maple floor was covered with a big tent. We rented a tent, so we had a great monetary obligation in this what we called the Firecracker Festival before we ever opened it. And another man and I served as general chairman of it one year. We had different people general chairman of it each year. But it's like a lot of other things. It was like the Western Week. I suppose people have told you about the Western Week that we have here. Well, a lot of the same people do these things, so they tend to get burned out. But the Western Week was another thing that was started by the Chamber of Commerce in, I think, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And we'd have all this thing for a week downtown around the square, and everybody wore Western gear. And this was in the days when Gunsmoke was popular on television. Mm-hmm. And we had a guy who was Matt Dillon, and another man who was Chester on Gunsmoke in those days. But we served free food. We had stew each night on the square, and
one year they had barbecue, I think.
Yeah, and we would serve several thousand people, all free. And again, it was like a lot of other things.
There again, Laura Peck did most of the cooking.
Yeah, Laura Peck and Bob Miller kind of oversaw all the cooking, because that was a big deal to cook that much stew, and it had to be cooked in big vats, which they cooked at the dairy. But we would serve several thousand people.
Before that, I think I talked to you about the jubilees they had around the square, and that was run pretty much on the same idea as the chamber. Of course, they didn't have a chamber then, but carnival and acrobats would come to. They had a stage set up for that, and it drew a lot of people to our little village.
Yeah, what period would they have the Jubilees?
Oh, let's see. I imagine around 28.
Yeah. Anybody talk to you about the Chautauquas?
A few people have just mentioned a few of them, but do you recall any?
I remember
She remembers them more
because
than I do because they were.
that was held about a week long, because I remember that I, being younger, but my two older sisters and brother would camp out in a tent out there for the whole week. It was just like a little vacation for them.
This was at what now is the Forest Preserve Park again.
And they had horseshoe contests, they had races, and they had food stands, and I don't remember anything about any carnival because I don't know if they even had them, but I do remember every night they had a different program. Talent would come in, they'd have plays, they'd have musicians, bands. It was all, of course, all this area is torn down now. It was a covered bleacher. That was built originally, I think, for horse racing.
Yeah, they used to have county fairs and have horse races there.
Mm-hmm. But my grandfather was the champion horseshoe pitcher of one year. That was, and had gotten a gold horseshoe that I think was kind of a memory piece to hang on to. But I remember as a child, I've always liked to whistle, and they had a beautiful whistler come in there. I was quite young because it's been back in 1925, so I'm kind of gathering about looking back. But
We were discussing the Chautauquas. Can you tell me if there's anything else you particularly recall?
one thing I remember is that we had a lot of great speakers that came in, and of course, being a child, I wasn't too interested in what their contents of their speaking was, but I'm sure a lot of them were politicians.
Yes, a lot of the politicians in those days really got their start as Chautauqua speakers because they had to develop a great voice because there weren't any loud speakers then, and so in order for the people to hear them, they had to be able to have a strong speaking voice. A man who later became senator from Illinois, Everett Dirksen from Pekin, got his start as a young man as a Chautauqua speaker, and developed into what they called in those days a great orator. He had a great speaking voice and could talk for long periods of time. A very interesting speaker too, by the way.
At that period, that would have really been the only way for people to come in contact with politicians because there wasn't the TV.
Chautauqua drew a lot of people from all over central Illinois. And those were days it was hard to even come into town. The only way it would be by your four wheels.
Were those connected at all with fairs where they would bring their baked goods, or was that a different type of fair?
Well, it was strictly different than a fair, yes.
They didn't have any of those kind of contests at these.
Oh, that I can't remember.
I don't recall that they had that sort of thing at the Chautauquas. That was more at all the county fairs, and of course there used to be a lot of county fairs all over the state, a lot more than there are now.
To go back, when you were mayor, you told us about several of the highlights. Who were some of the people that were on city council when you were mayor, and how long did you continue to be mayor?
Well, first I was elected mayor in 1949 and served until 1961, 12 years as mayor. And I believe that's the longest that anybody's ever served as mayor of Monticello. As to who was on the council at that time, Al Parsons was a city clerk. Al still lives in Monticello, and he was city clerk long before I became mayor and was city clerk after I became mayor. I don't know how many years he served, but a long number of years. Other council members were Ray Albert, who is no longer living, Bill Burgess, who's no longer living, Don Timmons, who is living in Monticello, Howard Clodfelder, who's no longer living, Charlie Norris, who is still living in Monticello, and Dr. Landers was a councilman at that time, and we had our council meetings in the second floor of the building, which now houses the Gamble store on the southeast corner of the square. That building belonged to the city of Monticello at that time, and also in the back of that building housed the fire truck. We only had one fire truck at that time, and there were no firefighting facilities for outside city limits like there are today. You have the volunteer fire departments outside the city now, but we didn't have any of those in those days. If you lived outside of the city of Monticello and lived very far out and you had a fire, it was just too bad. There was no firefighting equipment available for you. But we had our one fire truck in the back of that building. E. Hubbard had his plumbing business in the basement of the building at that time. And Elmer Anke had his grocery store in the first floor of the building where the Gamble store is now. Well, then later we built the city building, which is on North Hamilton Street, where it is today. And by that time they had developed the volunteer fire department for country folks. And so we had 2 fire trucks then. And this was back in the days when sales tax for the city of Monticello first started. And I remember that we saved our money for quite a while and saved up $22,000 to buy a new fire truck for the city of Monticello. But it took quite a long time to save up $22,000. And we sold the old city building to Elmer Amke. And I remember in looking at the abstract of the city building, it only had 12 entries on and went back to 1842. And the man that had that ground in 1842 had a mortgage on it, and the mortgage was for $600, and it was to be paid in merchantable pork to be delivered to Attica, Indiana. It wasn't paid in dollars, it was to be paid in merchantable pork to be delivered to Attica, Indiana, and by the way, he defaulted on the loan. He didn't pay it. But then we got the Dew City building and worked over the fire department at that time, and in that 12 years period of time, we most all the streets in Monticello at that time were what we called oiled streets. We had a few paved streets, but not near as many as they have today. And we blacktopped all of those streets, passed a bond issue, and blacktopped all the streets during that period of time. But serving on the council and mayor back 30 years ago was much different than it is today. You didn't have all of the people who are trying to sue public officials and all. I didn't have all that in those days, and it wasn't as complicated in small town government as it is today.
How did you decide to not run again?
Well, I either had to decide to make a living working in the bank or being mayor, and the mayor didn't pay enough, so I had to.
No choice.
I didn't have any choice. It got to be more work being mayor, and so I didn't have time to do it anymore.
Well, then you moved out to Stoddard Acres, too.
Yes, we moved out of town, moved to Stoddard Acres at that time.
What was transpiring for you at the bank at that period?
Well, I think let's talk a little bit about the banking business in Monticello to go back a little further than when I started in the bank. I think we go back to, say, the middle 1920s. Well, a little bit before that, we had 3 banks in Monticello. We had the Moore State Bank, which is where the National Bank is now. We had the First National Bank, which is where the Candlewick Inn is now. And then we had a bank on the south side of the square, and I don't recall the name of that bank, but it was owned and operated by a man by the name of Jodier and his family. But that bank wasn't there in the middle 1920s. At the time I start remembering about it, there were just the two banks, the Moore State Bank and the First National Bank. Now, both those banks closed in the bank moratorium in 1933, and neither one of them opened as banks again. Bill Dighton, who was the president of the First National Bank, his bank ultimately paid the depositors all their deposits, but none of the shareholders in the bank got any money out of it. As a matter of fact, in those days, if you're a shareholder in a bank, and the bank closed, you not only lost what you had in it as a shareholder, but you had to put up an equal amount of money if it were possible for you to do it. So that's what happened in those two banks in those days. The Moore State Bank, as I recall, paid out about 55% of what the depositors had on hand. There wasn't such a thing as Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in those days. You had no one guaranteeing your deposits except the integrity of the bank itself. So both of those gentlemen that operated those banks went into bankruptcy and lost all of their holdings at that time. So from the early spring of 1933 to December of 1933, we had no bank in Monticello. I was, at that time, I graduated from high school in 1933 and was a bookkeeper for Monticello Grain Company. And we went to D-Land and had a bank account in D-Land at that time. Had to drive over there and take our deposits over there.
You want to speak to him about Ellerton then? About him coming in wanting to take a trip?
Well, we'll get to that a little bit later. But then the National Bank was formed then, and I think opened in December of 1933. And then we only had one bank in town until 1946 when the First State Bank opened. So banking was a little different in those days. And of course, when I started in 1950, our bank only had about $1 million in deposits at that time. Loans, banks at that time made very few house loans. Their function, as far as lending was concerned, was mostly to business people and to farmers, and of course made some loans for people to buy automobiles, but not the installment loans as we know them today. If a person wanted to buy an automobile and wanted to borrow the money for a year, why, we would do that some. But mostly they paid it off at the end of the year when the note came due, and if they couldn't, they paid what they could, and we renewed the balance for another year. But it was not, payments were not made on an installment basis as they are today. So the banking business has changed a great deal over all the years. Now everything's done electronically today, and back then when I started, we did all the bookkeeping. We had a very crude bookkeeping machine, did it all ourselves, and there was Gerald Hofferty was the president of the bank, and Ernie Lohr was the cashier, and he had formerly worked at the old First National Bank in Monticello. Oscar Curry worked there, and Francis Rose from B-Mint and myself. We were the whole bank. We did everything. But
it was before air conditioning, too.
Yes, that was before air conditioning. We didn't do anything, of course, except, as I say, a very crude bookkeeping machine. And now then, everything is done electronically. And as a matter of fact, in our bank today, transactions that are initiated at the teller's window goes direct into the computer by telephone line immediately, so that you can always know what you have in an account just by pressing a button. And it's altogether different now, and will be a lot different in the next few years, even than it is now. More things will be done electronically. I'm not saying that's a great thing for the banking business. I'm just saying that's the way it's going to be.
When did you become vice president and then president?
Well, I became vice president. I started in 1950 at the bank, and I became vice president in 1951, and served as vice president until 1972 when I became president of the bank, and served as president until I retired.
And when did the bank, it moved from where you started?
Yes, we started on the south side of the square where Bill Tedder's office is right now, next to the Dairy Queen. And in 1952, we moved down to the building where the bank is now. We were only in the east half of the first building, not where the theater building is or was. And we stayed in the east half of that building until 1964, when we didn't even own the building. We rented it from the Kratz family. And in 1964, we bought the building from the Kratz family, and then took over the west half of the building, where I think I'd mentioned earlier the theater used to be, before it got into the newer theater building. And then we operated in there, of course, until and we acquired the old theater building in, I think we actually took possession of that in about 1976 or something like that, and then didn't have anything in it until we worked it over, and now the bank is in the old theater building too, as well as the other building.
You had talked to me a little bit about the tax base in Monticello. Could you explain that?
Well, the people in Monticello have always had a big break as far as paying taxes are concerned compared to other towns of our size. Back in 1922, Illinois Power Company, it was known as Illinois-Iowa Power Company at that time, made a deal with Monticello in which Monticello was named the home office of Illinois Power Company, and that meant that their capital stock tax was paid and could be paid in the town in which their home office was. And although this wasn't their chief operating office, it was designated as their home office, and consequently they paid their capital stock tax here. Well, that meant a great deal to Monticello. And one of the reasons why that arrangement was done was because the man who was in charge of the tax department of Illinois Power Company was a man by the name of Bill Watts, who was a Monticello boy and could see the great advantage both to Monticello and to Illinois Power Company to pay their taxes here. So over all the years, they have paid a great deal of the taxes in Monticello, and at times even paid 85% of all of the taxes in the city of Monticello. Mm-hmm. So not only did people have cheap taxes here, but the school district, the cities, the township, all were able to do things because money was never really a problem with them because of the great taxing ability that we had from Illinois Power Company. So that has changed now since there's no longer any personal property tax on corporations in the state of Illinois. But the fact that they did pay all those taxes here carried over into what they call the replacement tax now of corporate income tax, And Monticello still is a great benefactor from the fact that we get more of this corporate replacement tax now than we would have had Illinois Power Company not been here. And General Telephone later moved their home office of record here and paid their capital stock tax in Monticello, which added again to the point where those two corporations paid 90% of the taxes in Monticello.
You talked about being a member of Chamber of Commerce. What other organizations have you belonged to in Monticello?
Well, I guess at one time or another I've been president of most all of them. I've been president of the Chamber of Commerce, president of the Rotary Club, president of the Monticello Development Corporation, which was a corporation set up to attract industrial businesses to Monticello. Dumore, I've been president of Dumore Corporation, which was a corporation formed to sort of be the leader in revamping downtown area in Monticello. And the whole north side of the square was really done over because of instigation of Dumore Corporation. And Keith Hudson, by the way, was one of the people who was very strong in the Dumore Corporation, and probably if it hadn't have been for Keith Hudson, we probably never would have had that corporation. But I served for several years as president of that corporation. I've been chairman of the zoning commission, chairman of the appeals board, and can't think of any others right now.
I'd say that's a good list.
Plus his church work.
What about organizations that you belong to, Mrs. Anderson?
Well, I used to belong to quite a few. It seemed like not only belonging to different organizations, being the wife of the mayor for so many years, I was expected to be on every drive there was to be had. And then I was active in the Girl Scout work and Doggers Club, and at one time we had the Presbyterian Missionary Society, and I was president of that. And well, it seems to me that time has gone by, and I've had my fill of organizations.
How many children have you had? I don't think we covered that.
Well, we have a daughter who is Jane Ellen, and a son named James Wilson. And they both have gone to school here. They started their kindergarten and grammar school at the Washington School, and went on through to high school here. And then they got more education at the University of Illinois. And I don't know, I think, Andy, you can go ahead and
Both
tell
of them
them
graduated from the University of Illinois. Both of them have master's degrees from the University of Illinois. Jane has her master's degree in political science and is working on her PhD degree. And Jim has a master's degree in accounting, and also he has a CPA degree and is an accountant for Emerson Electric in St. Louis. Jane still works on and does some part-time research work for the University of Illinois.
Well, I thank you very much, both of you. I've enjoyed this.
Okay. I think as a final thing, I think we'd just like to say that, of course, Monticello has been our hometown, but we've enjoyed our married life living in Monticello. We have lived away from here twice in our married life, both times in Chicago, and we came back to Monticello both times because we are small-town people, and we really have enjoyed it here. I think Monticello has just been a fine place to raise a family, fine school systems, fine churches, and I know that I speak for both of us when I say that we've certainly enjoyed our life in Monticello and intend to continue living here, only to go to Florida a little bit when the snow flies and get out of the snow, but come back in the spring.
Miss the cold just a little bit.
Just a little.
Well, Monticello has benefited from both of you being here, too.
Thank you.
As a postscript to this tape, Mrs. Anderson served as an election judge for 15 years and also served as a census taker in 1960 when the population of Monticello was around 3,600. At that time, there were 3 census takers, and they canvassed the town door to door.